They had written on his tray 5 words in bold red ink: special case, sensitive. That was how they had labeled him. Not his name, not his identity, but his skin. Minutes earlier, they had dragged him out of first class, in front of a full cabin, boarding pass removed, membership removed, and dignity removed. But no one reacted. No one spoke. And no one, not one, bothered to ask who he really was, because they thought they knew. What they didn't know was that they had just humiliated the man who owned the airline they worked for. This wasn't just a flight gone wrong. It was a lesson in how prejudice hides behind the mask of convention, and how it dissolves when the truth, at last, steps back into the aisle. What are you stopping to think about right now? Stay connected. This story will make you think. Like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from and what moments in the story made you stop and think. Let's chat in the comments. Elijah stepped through the doors of the first-class cabin, where the warm yellow light from the high chandeliers reflected off the plush leather seats, creating an oasis in the sky. The sound of his leather shoes was not urgent, but each step was heavy with meaning. As he moved through the rows of seats, the eyes of the passengers around him began to scan from head to toe, like invisible lightning bolts touching his skin. The looks were not openly hostile, but they were clearly not welcoming. They looked him up and down, and though no one spoke, the hesitant silence was more audible than any words. He sat down, put his bag on the seat next to him, and for a moment, the silence seemed to stop. A few seconds later, a figure appeared, walking quickly toward him. Kendra Wallace, the first-class chief flight attendant, about 30 years old, approached with a smile that was not exactly welcoming, but one of duty. When she stood in front of Elijah, she paused, looked at the seat he occupied, and lowered her eyes. She spoke softly, but the tone could not hide the command in it. "Excuse me, you need to move somewhere else." It wasn't a request, it was a command, even if it wasn't direct, and her silence was all the disrespect she could muster. Kendra couldn't bring herself to look Elijah in the eye, her eyes downcast, avoiding his gaze. Every word she spoke was cut, cold, and dry. She didn't seem to think about why he was sitting there, or even if he really deserved it. She only saw a man sitting in a place that didn't belong to him, and first-class seats, to her, were reserved for people of other shapes. Elijah didn't respond. He sat there silent for a moment. He knew what was happening, and he knew exactly what he was facing. He wasn't just a passenger on this flight. He was a man who had achieved a position he should be proud of. And now he was being asked to leave, for no other reason than his skin. Kendra's words weren't enough to shake him. He sat up straight, kept his eyes steady, and knew he had the right to defend not just his seat, but his dignity. Suddenly, another figure entered the first-class cabin, attracting all eyes. Charles Carrington, a longtime customer of the airline, was wearing a luxurious suit that no one would notice. His leather shoes walked steadily, without a moment of hesitation, as if this cabin had long been reserved for him. Carrington's face, rich and powerful, radiated a complacency that no one seemed to dare to question. His silver-streaked hair did not take away his noble appearance. On the contrary, it further highlighted the maturity of a man accustomed to power, accustomed to demanding that everything around him obey him. Carrington stopped right in front of Elijah, his eyes unflinching. "This is my seat," he said, his voice hard and unwavering. The words were a simple statement, but carried the weight of his presence. "I always sit here," he continued, as if it were a matter of course, beyond dispute. He didn't ask, he commanded, and his eyes held no apprehension, only an expectation that Elijah would give way without further conversation. Elijah looked up at Charles Carrington, a man he did not know, but who had a hidden power, a power that Carrington used to make the space feel more stuffy. Elijah saw, even in that cold gaze, Carrington's complacency, his belief that this distinction was perfectly reasonable, that the rules of society allowed him to stand on a higher pedestal. To him, asking a man to give up his seat was natural, his right, and no one could overrule it. Carrington saw Elijah not as a person, but as an inanimate object, part of the landscape he could manipulate. Only an outsider could fail to notice the stark distinction in his gaze. In this cabin, Carrington was not just asking for a seat, he was asserting something greater. His power. a power built on invisible distinctions that many, like Elijah, suffered in silence. And in this moment, Elijah understood that the confrontation was not just between him and the woman standing before him, but with a system, with a world that he could never forget, where people were already discriminated against in even the most ordinary situations. In the tense space, the silence seemed to gather in the first-class cabin. All eyes were on Elijah. He did not rush to stand up. Kendra stood there, her eyes filled with pity, even a little worry. But her words were still sharp, full of confidence. "Excuse me, you have to move. This is Mr. Carrington's seat." She kept her head down as she spoke, but her eyes could not hide her disrespect. It was just words of obedience, without any sympathy, because in this world his obedience was too obvious. But Elijah, with his heart still holding on to his dignity, did not waver. He did not push his chair back, did not rush to pack his things. His eyes looked up, meeting Carrington's eyes, the man he had never met, but who was testing his dignity. "I paid for this place," Elijah said, his voice calm, but not lacking in certainty. "This is my ticket, and I have no reason to leave." The words were light and innocuous, but in this space they were an undeniable statement. He was not a man to be subdued. He was not a man to stand idly by and wait for recognition. He had earned his rights, and no one could take them away because of the blind discrimination of a few others. Kendra and Carrington stood there, as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. They exchanged hesitant glances, a little doubtful, maybe even confused. They had never faced a situation like this before. Usually someone like Elijah would have given up, apologized, and retreated. But not Elijah. He sat there, unmoved, his eyes filled with determination. A hint of a smile crossed his lips, soft but not weak. It was a confirmation that he was not one to be swayed, that even in this situation, he was still in control. All around, the passengers remained silent and watched. No one spoke. A few glanced furtively, but no one had the courage to protest. Everyone stood still, as if this part of the war had nothing to do with them. The atmosphere became thick. Everyone listened, but no one dared to speak. Was it because they were afraid? Or were they so used to this invisible discrimination that they no longer had the courage to protest? Elijah didn't need anyone's words. He didn't need acceptance or sympathy. He just needed to stand firm in his beliefs, even in the face of injustice. He still refused to give in. And in that moment, amid the silent gazes and stifling atmosphere, Elijah taught all who witnessed that sometimes courage doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be steady, like a steadfast pillar, unshaken by any pressure. The air in first class was thick now, so tense that every breath could shatter the heavy silence. Elijah sat there, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, his gaze calmly scanning the people watching him as if he were an exception. In that moment, instead of raising his voice to argue or letting the insult drag him down to the zone of instinctive reaction, he pulled his phone from his jacket, opened the membership app, and tapped on priority assistance. Then on encountering a customer service issue in the cabin, need live assistance. A button press, a short signal, no noise, no drama, just a calm action the way he always faced the world, with dignity and clarity. Less than 3 minutes later, the first-class cabin door opened. It was not a flight attendant nor a ground staff member who entered, but a man in a dark blue suit, a silver name tag pinned to his left chest. Brent Halverson, regional manager. He did not rush forward, but walked in gently like someone who was responsible for solving a problem. He was tall and had a confident demeanor, but also had a certain politeness, seemingly a balance between power and humility. Brent stopped in front of Elijah, his eyes scanning the determined face of the man sitting in first class. He did not flinch. There was no sign of fear or confusion. He, like someone who was used to these tense moments, began in a soft but firm voice. "Mr. Elijah, I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I think we can resolve this peacefully. We can move you to another seat that will be more convenient for this flight." Brent emphasized the word convenient, as if it were an irrefutable solution, as if he were offering a better option, a reasonable compromise. Yet as the words came out, there was no wavering in Elijah's gaze. He remained where he was, hands resting lightly on the arms of the chair, eyes fixed on Brent, no sign of compromise. "I paid for this chair," Elijah said, his voice low and firm, "and I'm not moving." Brent, still keeping his composure, glanced at the boarding pass Elijah handed him. At this moment, a sudden undercurrent rose in Brent's mind. He looked closely at the information on the pass, the location, the ticket number, and the name of the person checking in. The truth hit him like a direct shock. Elijah was indeed a passenger. First class, everything was in order. A wave of confusion began to spread across Brent's face, and he lost his initial seriousness. A feeling of embarrassment, unable to be hidden, filled his eyes. In that moment, Brent realized his mistake. He had not checked the information thoroughly before interfering with Elijah's rights, and now he was faced with an undeniable truth. That feeling of confusion, like a wave, slowly spread, making it impossible for him to maintain his usual cold demeanor. Elijah noticed the change in Brent's eyes, but he didn't say anything more. He just sat there, not needing to say another word. He had proven that in this world, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, you have the right to be respected. And sometimes that's something that even those in power can't take away. Brent was still standing there, holding his boarding pass, his gaze no longer cold as a man of duty but rather calm, as if he were trying to balance his managerial position with a growing feeling that he had just entered an unpleasant lesson. He turned to Elijah, who still said nothing, only nodded, his gaze remaining remarkably calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brent said slowly, his voice carrying through the once suffocatingly quiet first-class cabin. "I would like to inform you that the passenger in seat 2A is not only legally entitled to board this flight, but is also one of the founding shareholders and operating owners of the airline we serve." The moment, silence, no applause, no awe, just a strange, sudden silence, as if the air had been sucked out of the air. All eyes turned to Elijah, the man they had viewed with judgment, suspicion, and somehow indifference just moments before. Now, surprise was lurking in the corners of their eyes, but even more so, regret. Kendra, the head flight attendant, was speechless. Her eyes widened, then drooped slightly, her hand still clutching the tablet to her chest, as if to hide the embarrassment that was overwhelming her. Carrington shifted slightly, no longer maintaining her complacent look, but quietly bowed her head, avoiding anyone's gaze. Elijah didn't smile, or triumph, or indulge. He just looked at Brent, then inclined his head slightly, a thank you for telling him the truth. There was no need for explanation, no need to defend his honor. It was his silence and dignity that moved the entire first-class cabin, not because he was the boss, but because he held his dignity in a place that had tried to take it away from him. Brent handed back the boarding pass with both hands, a small but meaningful gesture. "Sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Brooks," he said, this time using his name, no title, no emphasis on authority, just an acknowledgement of dignity. And then, without anyone needing a signal, a few passengers began to nod to Elijah, slowly but sincerely. The eyes had stopped judging, had withdrawn their whispers into looks. Passengers who had turned away now met his gaze, as if trying to send something inexpressible, a silent apology, but not meaningless. Elijah sat for a moment, not long, but long enough for every gaze in first class to question itself. No one had forced him to leave, no one had the right to demand that he do so. But when he stood up, slowly gathering his coat and the bag that had been sitting on his head, the cabin fell silent again, not with surprise, but with something they had never felt before. Silent respect. He didn't say a word, didn't turn to look at Kendra, didn't glance at Carrington, didn't look at Brent, who had just changed the entire atmosphere of the cabin with a simple truth. Elijah just nodded, a small nod, but it carried more weight than any word either of them had ever spoken. The sound of the small suitcase rolling across the floor of the cabin was very soft, but it seemed to drown out all other sounds. No one dared to speak. No one wanted to break the silence. A silence that was no longer one of confusion, but of recognition. From the eyes that had once avoided, that had once silently judged, now there were only slow bows, eyes that silently followed his figure as he walked towards the cabin door. No one called his name. No one held him back. But everyone understood. There were things that, once witnessed, could never be forgotten. Kendra was still standing by the wall of the cabin, her hand pressed to her chest as if to hold back something that was breaking inside her. Carrington, once so confident that he didn't care, was now as still as a tree whose roots had been broken by the wind, no longer in power, but with the sense of loss of someone who had just realized he had never truly seen others with an equal eye. And Brent, the calm manager, could only bow his head slightly as Elijah passed by, not to apologize for a personal mistake, but to bow his head before a lesson he had never been prepared to learn. The air in the cabin no longer smelled of tension. It had changed color. The others sat still, not moving, not calling for service, not opening their laptops, as if they all needed a few more minutes to define something deeper, something they had never thought they would have to learn on a flight. Elijah stepped through the curtain into business class as if he had made a journey, not from place to place, but from a denied truth to an undeniable truth. He had no need to win, no need to speak, no need to punish. It was the way he walked, straight, silent, that was the loudest protest. A revenge not of deeds, but of character. And as the first-class door closed behind him, only one thing remained in the minds of all who witnessed it. This was not just a story about a chair. This was a story about how one man maintained his dignity in a place that seemed out of place, and in truth made all prejudices collapse. When Elijah stepped out of first class, there was no applause, no apologies. But the change had begun, quiet and profound. Those who had once turned away now dared not look one another in the eye. A few passengers turned to each other, eyes lost, trying to find a way to justify their own reactions, but no one spoke. In that silence, shame spoke louder than any words. It crept into every breath, every squeeze of the hand, every look that was no longer as confident as before. On the faces of the flight attendants, especially Kendra, there was no longer confusion, but a very real anguish, as if they had just seen themselves in a mirror that could no longer be avoided. And Brent Halverson, who had believed he had always behaved properly, could only bow his head, having learned a lesson not found in any service manual, a lesson about truth, about courage, and about the thin line between professionalism and prejudice. There are shocks that come from screaming, but there are also awakenings that come from silence. And that is what Elijah left behind. He didn't need to win them over. He didn't need to take anything back, because the way he maintained his dignity in adversity was the clearest statement. Justice doesn't come from putting others down, but from not letting yourself be put down. That story, although it only took place in the plane cabin for a few dozen minutes, its echoes certainly lingered long after, in the minds of those who witnessed it. Not because they witnessed someone being treated unfairly, but because they witnessed someone refusing to accept it with all their dignity. And that is how the truth changes people. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with determination, quietly and with dignity that is never bought.